It was important for me to come here in order to clarify our position and to do everything so that there were no misconceptions between our forces and your forces. In all the contacts we had between us, when we agreed and when we had some disagreements, our dialogue was in an atmosphere of mutual respect.
All Russia's actions in the Middle East region have always been and will be very responsible. As to Syria, we know that the Syrian army and Syria as a whole are in such a state that they have no time for a second round. They need to save their own state.
Recent evidence shows a growing deployment of Russian forces in Syria, which Israel fears would trickle down to Hezbollah and other militant organizations. Putin has pledged to continue military support for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, saying the aim is to fight Islamic State group. Tensions increased between Jerusalem and Russia earlier this year when Moscow announced it would go ahead with a deal to sell S-300 missile defense systems to Iran. Israel charges that Iran poses an existential threat to its security.
There's been a worrying development for the US-led air campaign against Islamic State in Syria. The Pentagon says Russian fighter jets have now arrived in Syria in support of the Assad dictatorship. This raises the prospect of US and Russian warplanes in the same skies, fighting on opposite sides.
Meanwhile, US officials have also said Russia has sent fighter jets to Syria and believe Moscow is building up its military presence there as Syrian President Bashar al-Assad loses ground to the various rebel groups confronting him. On Friday, the US and Russian defense ministers spoke by telephone for the first time in more than a year to discuss the recent development.
Tonight, there is a worrying development for America's air war over Syria. The Pentagon says that Russian fighter jets have now arrived in Syria in support of the Assad dictatorship. This raises the prospect of U.S. and Russian warplanes in the same skies fighting on opposite sides. Here's Chip Reed.
In addition to the fighter jets, these satellite photos of the base taken in the last few days also show Russian helicopters, transport aircraft, tanks, and armored personnel carriers. Some U.S. intelligence analysts believe the weapons could be used to attack rebel forces, threatening the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, Russia's longtime ally but an enemy of the U.S. One U.S. official recently said Russian military intervention in Syria would be a game changer, creating the potential for run-ins with U.S. warplanes that are conducting airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. Today, in an effort to avoid potential conflict between the U.S. and Russia, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter spoke by phone with Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. In a statement, the Pentagon called it a constructive conversation.
A shell has landed on Russia's embassy in the Syrian capital. The incident caused no damage, though no reports of casualties from the attack either. Russia's condemned the shelling of its embassy in Damascus. Moscow's called for action over, quote, the terrorist act. Similar mortar and rocket attacks on the Syrian capital have been blamed on foreign-backed militants. They've repeatedly shelled Damascus in recent months. Indiscriminate attacks have left many people dead. Earlier, our correspondent in Damascus, Mohammed Ali, gave us an update on the shelling of the Russian embassy.
Of course, this is not the first time the foreign-backed militants who are in eastern Al-Ghouta, particularly Jobar and Douma areas that are militant-held areas, usually attack Damascus with mortar shells. And of course, this step, as you have just said, comes after the Russian officials' statements regarding the military support increasingly going to Syria to support the Syrian government against those foreign-backed militants. So definitely this is an action that reflects the anger of the militants in eastern Al-Ghouta after such increasing support to the Syrian government. However, not only the Russian embassy is under attack in Damascus by mortar shells. During the unrest, as you know, hundreds of people, civilians, have been killed because of such attacks from eastern Al-Ghouta, particularly where the so-called Jaish al-Islam militant group, which is heavily backed by Saudi Arabia, is always shelling those areas in Damascus.
We have supported the Syrian government, I would like to say that, as it confronts a terrorist aggression. We have provided and will provide all the necessary military and technical support. And we call on other countries to join us. People are fleeing Syria primarily because of the military actions that were largely imposed externally by deliveries of weapons and other special equipment. People are fleeing to escape the atrocities committed by terrorists. We know what they do, how they kill people, how they destroy cultural monuments, which I've already mentioned, and so on. The refugees are primarily fleeing the radicals, and if Russia had not supported Syria, the situation in this country would have been even worse than in Libya, and the flow of refugees would have been even bigger.
Russia and Egypt have called for the formation of a broad front with Syria to fight terrorism. The call was made by the Russian President Vladimir Putin after a meeting with his visiting Egyptian counterpart Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Putin told reporters he's discussed the importance of creating a broad anti-terrorist front involving key regional and international players. He said this front needs to include Syria, which is fighting a multiple-year war with foreign-based terrorists. Putin also said he and el-Sisi have agreed that Russian-Egyptian cooperation over regional issues guarantees the basic interests of the two countries. He added that Moscow and Cairo have common views regarding the need to step up the struggle against international terrorism, specifically against the Daesh terrorist group.
The biggest catalyst for the mass migration to Europe is Syria's civil war, which is believed to have killed 250,000 people and driven an estimated 11 million Syrians from their homes. Secretary of State John Kerry warned Russia's foreign minister this weekend about reports of Russia increasing specific types of support for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime. Kerry says the increased support could escalate the conflict and the refugee crisis. Joining me now from Washington to discuss the war in Syria is Anthony Korsman, who is the Arlie A. Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Sir, let's begin with Secretary of State Kerry's concerns. At this point in the conflict, what would a Russian infusion of support for Assad's army and his regime mean?
People are concerned as there's evidence that he may be providing, or Putin may be providing, something like 1,000 people's worth of prefabricated housing. And that's led some analysts to believe that Russia may be deploying air units and modern combat aircraft, or a new kind of advisory team. Now, any buildup will help Assad ride out or survive, at least for a while, the opposition. Any kind of active air presence would present serious problems for the United States, for Turkey, for the other coalition countries flying air sorties because of the risk that there might be some kind of incident between the Russians and the air forces operating against the Islamic State. And no matter what happens, that kind of operation would present problems for the United States because our Arab allies, particularly Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, are supporting some of the forces on the ground that are opposing Assad directly.
This conflict began in 2011. It's 2015. At this point, what stands out to you as the major issues keeping us from a diplomatic solution here?
Well, I think there are several reasons, but the most important one is no one has emerged as a credible alternative. Syria is now divided really into four parts. There's a Kurdish area. The Kurds have no great incentive to be part of Syria. They were treated as second-class citizens before this began, and many didn't even have identification papers. You have the Islamic State, which occupies a significant part of eastern Syria, particularly along the river area. It's not a densely populated area, but it's one the Islamic State can actually control. You then have a mix of some 26 to 35 different opposition groups that are doing most of the fighting against Assad. They're more in the central, heavily populated areas of Syria, but they have almost nothing in common with the Assad regime, with the Islamic State, or with the Kurds. And while there are groups outside Syria that claim to represent the opposition, the fact is that many of them were tied to more moderate, secular military movements, which have effectively been defeated and virtually disappeared.
There's been quite a bit of criticism about neighboring countries not stepping in to help ease the humanitarian crisis, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. What's your analysis as why these countries have not stepped in and stepped up?
All of them, frankly, are deeply concerned at what these refugees might be and who they might have alignments with. All of them are dealing with their own problems. Iran, Yemen, Islamic State groups, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And all of them tend to be relatively closed societies where security puts very tight limits on any form of immigration.
Anthony Quartersman, thank you so much for helping us understand it a bit more.
Thank you.
The entry of Russian expertise into Syria, that's changed things, hasn't it?
Right. Well, Russia has had a long-time military political relationship with Syria going back to the Cold War years. But what's happening now is that Putin is making a decision from all these reports to amplify the Russian presence in Syria, especially in this base they have south of Latakia. It's the only...
Is this on the coast? Is this a
yes.
coastal base for Russian Navy ships as well?
It's on the Mediterranean coast. It's the only warm water Mediterranean port that the Soviet naval fleet has. So they attach a great deal of importance to that. But beyond that, it's really a play by Putin to inject himself into the decision-making on the future of Syria. And his major motivation is the threat of Islamic radicalism. He's made this clear for several years to top-level American officials.